Hi everyone, welcome. What we have here in front of me is my oldest red wiggler bin. This system, it's got a piece of wood across the top. It's just a little reminder to myself that this bin is not being fed. In my mind, the feeding stage has already ended, and I'm now kind of in that second stage where I'm allowing the worms to continue to break down any sort of residual scraps that might still be in that bin. So I'm not giving them anything fresh. I'm trying to convince them to focus their energy on any sort of little scraps of bedding and food that might still be in that bin. That bin has been in that so-called foraging mode now for 19 days. So 19 days ago it received its final feeding, and to even help promote that foraging activity further, I went in there 10 days ago and I even picked out all kinds of little scraps of leftover food and stuff to the best of my ability, and I moved into other active red wiggler bins to really let the worms focus on the little tiny scraps in there. I know there's little scraps of paper, there's little scraps of leaf stems, all kinds of odds and ends in there that need to be broken down, so I didn't want them distracted by any sort of larger food particles in the bin. But now for 10 days, I've not seen what's going on in there. So I really wanted to just check in on that bin to see how it's progressing. Because if at some point I end the foraging phase, at that point I could start focusing on how do I go about harvesting the castings out of the container and relocating the worms into a new space. So, like I do sometimes, I put together just a little informational board here with some information on it. And what I've got depicted down here on the bottom is the bin that we're referring to. And that first phase of feeding and composting lasted 125 days in the case of this bin. And like I said earlier, 19 days have elapsed since it received its last feeding. And it's, so far it's 19 days and counting as far as that foraging phase is concerned. And these are metrics that I'm going to start tracking a little bit better. I've got a tracking spreadsheet where I keep track of various information, but this one distinction of how long a bin has been in these different phases of its life cycles is a piece of information that I've only got scattered about and not really recorded very accurately. So I actually jotted down information here which depicts the time frames that went on the most recently harvested red wiggler bin, where in that particular case the bin ran for 96 days in its normal feeding mode, and then I left it for 38 days to forage until such a time that I felt like the material in the bin was really fine, very nicely broken down, and then I proceeded into a 25-day cycle of trying to migrate the worms out of the finished castings so that the castings could be depopulated and the worms could be relocated. So I'm just trying to see where we stand on this in the oldest of my red wiggler bins. So I'm going to get it up on the bench, try to size up how things are going. And there is one large piece of paper in there that's covering the top surface. I thought that if need be, I could maybe even remove that. If it's really starting to look like it's becoming a distraction, the worms are feeding on it when I really want them feeding on the bits and pieces scattered throughout the bin. So I might actually remove that, but other than that, I wasn't really planning to do anything other than look through the bin and try to determine how it stands in terms of, is it going to need to continue foraging or are we near the end? So let's get that thing up on the bench and get to work. So now let's get rid of these coverings here. I've really got no idea what to expect in here. After 10 days, I'm hoping that there's been some nice progress on the breakdown of the materials. But I definitely remember lots of little bits of paper scattered throughout the material. Lots of little leaf stems, which I certainly don't expect to see gone by this time yet. But I am hoping to see some progress in here. And I think based on what we observe in here, it'll also possibly help determine how I'm going to proceed with the depopulation of the worms out of the material and how I'm going to proceed with the harvesting of the castings. Oh, that's pretty interesting right there. That looks to me like a little jumble of mites. And I don't recall this bin actually having a mite issue. It's just so unusual how they're all kind of ganged up in one particular spot. It really makes me feel like if I do remove this piece of paper, then I'm going to want to get rid of those mites before I recycle the paper and reuse it elsewhere. So you know what I'll do is I'm just going to evict all these little guys off this top surface. This little guy's digging through a hole. That's how he came up. He didn't go around. He took the lazy way. He just burrowed right through the paper to get up onto the top surface. Top surface being pretty popular, being right there under the plastic where all the moisture is collecting. And the moisture is probably the reason that these mites are here too. Lots of castings material on the bottom of this thing. Makes me wonder if maybe it is time to also allow this material to start drying off a little bit. I've contemplated using a harvesting method in this bin, a little different from what I typically do nowadays. I think my preferred method of migrating worms out of the castings is to just let them do it themselves. You know, let the material get depleted almost entirely of food, and then when they're kind of really becoming desperate for a fresh meal, setting up one end of the bin with exactly what they're craving, a bunch of fresh food, fresh bedding. And at that point, maybe I've even allowed the bin to dry out a fair bit so that they're also craving a little bit more of a damp place that they could be. And then on their own accord, the worms all just leave the material, pretty much abandoning their finished compost for me to harvest it just by either pouring it out of the container or scooping it out of the container. And then all the worms are piled up in a single spot where I can relocate them easily to their new home, get them working on a fresh batch of materials. All right, lots and lots of really nice fresh castings out here on the surface. After 10 days, they've been busy. It's funny, while I was busy wiping all that material off that paper, I didn't really notice how all these worms suddenly vanished out of view. They really don't waste any time when there's bright lights overhead. They just want to get out of the bright lights and get out of view. So right away, I'm seeing some of the things that I think are some of the culprits in this bin that might require some time to break down. Large stems of leaves, although it breaks in half quite readily, and it is sort of splintering, so it's getting broken down, that's for sure. Stuff out on the surface may not be as saturated and easy to break down as stuff that might be below the surface. It'd be kind of nice to think that the only stuff remaining as far as leaf stems are these, but I doubt that that's the case. Here's some more examples of the stuff that I'd really like to see fully broken down before I consider this batch of compost to be complete and fine, finished material, ready for harvest. But some of the paper, you know, a couple of my concerns regarding that is that some of the paper that I used I am suspicious of, not knowing if it was really the type of paper the worms will break down. I didn't know if it was treated with something. A lot of the paper that I had shredded up and used as bedding seemed like it was just taking forever to break down. Made me wonder if it'll ever break down. And if it won't break down, then it does seem like the only recourse I have is to conduct a harvesting of the castings, which is not the migration method that I explained earlier, but another method where you actually screen the material, run the material all through a screener so that you can actually intercept and sift out any sort of larger particles. And that would address, you know, not only removing scraps of uncomposted paper that may or may not ever even get broken down, but also larger leaf stems, which might also significantly extend the period of time needed to get this bin to the finish line. So I'm just wanting to pick through here a little bit and assess how the material is progressing. And it is quite damp, so it seems like what we're doing here is also going to provide the benefit of airing out the material a little bit. So let's just start stirring the whole shebang up a little bit and see what we see. It's all kind of settled down, kind of matted down, because it is pretty dense. So I think a little aeration is not going to hurt. Here too, little sticks, stuff that's not going to, I don't know if it's a stick or a stem or what it is, but there's certainly abundant examples of the type of material that could, you know, take quite a while for the worms to break down. I'm really not clear about what to do about this paper. Because, you know, I'm going to bring this this piece of newspaper back here because it is such a good example. I believe I showed this last time this bin was out on the camera. But like right here on this edge, and even when we saw that one worm that came gobbling through the paper earlier, the worms do feed on paper because it's just, you know, wood pulp ultimately, right? But like here you can see examples of where the worms have really nibbled away a lot at the paper. And along this edge too, you can see quite a bit of it, a whole lot of it. And if I go picking through the bin and I find scraps of paper which seem to have nice, distinct cut edges, straight edges, like if the paper had just come out of the shredder, then it really makes me wonder if they're actually working that paper down or simply ignoring it. And if they're ignoring it, that means they're just going to continue to ignore it. They'll never touch this stuff. And my only way of getting it out of the material is to screen it out. This might be a good example too. It's a piece of the paper, I believe, that I've been concerned about. And it's got no rough edges. It's completely straight, just the way it came out of the shredder. And if it had any chance of getting broken down by the worms, they'd be full of little nibbling signs. So I don't know if I'm going to be in for this same situation in a number of my bins where I was using this type of paper. I had a good amount of it, so I spread that stuff all over the place in multiple bins. And I don't know if I'm just seeing it here so distinctly because this is the bin where I would like to see it gone the most. So I am still kind of, you know, torn on what to do here, but here another example of why I might want to really consider taking the light harvesting and sifting approach to retrieving the castings from this container is all those leaf stems too. But in order for that to work right, the material's got to be fine enough that it all just crumbles away and passes right through a screen very easily, which is clearly not the case here. So I was really just pondering whether I would continue with the plastic covering and let the worms continue breaking the stuff down really nice and fine, or if I was going to make the decision that migrating the worms out of the castings is not the right approach and that I should really get geared up for a light harvesting and screening of the material, in which case I need the material to be somewhat drier. So I am starting to feel like maybe the best approach in this bin is going to be to anticipate the need to screen the material to get rid of all this stuff out of it. And that would probably be the best approach to harvesting these castings. So I believe I am leaning towards that decision point at this point. To say that this bin is probably going to get harvested using that method of light separation. And by that I just mean, just like we saw earlier, the bright lights cause the worms to want to dive down out of view because, you know, bright light to a worm typically means, you know, sunshine, they're going to dry out, or maybe even just bright lights could mean that they're going to be visible to potential predators. So for multiple reasons, worms are going to try to get out of the bright light. They don't have eyes and they don't see the light, but in their skin they can sense the presence of light, so they react to it quite readily. So almost as soon as they start seeing brightness, they immediately start burrowing. So if we were to just leave this pile of material here covered in worms, within a minute or two we would see no worms. They would just burrow right out of view. Let's let that happen. Let's let it go. Certainly doesn't take very long. They all react almost immediately to the fact that there's a bunch of unpleasant light streaming down on top of them. And then before you know it, they're all out of view. So now I played that footage back for you at high speed, but I would say that in real life that was no more than maybe 2 minutes, 3 minutes tops for the worms to all burrow out of view to a safe spot that's not basking in bright light. So I'm just going to really do this. I'm going to continue on here and simply aerate the rest of the material in this bin. It's going to give us a little view of how many worms there really are in the material, and there's quite a few. This bin has a good sizable population, and it seems like they're doing a really nice job breaking the materials in here down. I just can't seem to resist the urge of taking anything down out of here that would really end up distracting them from breaking down the really fine particle matter in here, and you know, like that banana stem right there and these larger chunks of wood. I just can't seem to, they're not even wood, they're just the stems of leaves. I just can't seem to resist wanting to steer this bin in the right direction and focus their attention on stuff other than large banana peel stems and large chunks of leaf stems. I'd like for them to really break down any little tiny residual matter in the material. But you know, when it comes to these chunks of paper, I don't think there's much I can do. You know, I'm confident that over time it will break down because I believe it is paper, but I do believe there's also some sort of a treatment on that paper which is causing the worms to not like it. So I still feel like it's safe to expect that material to break down. It'll just take a great deal of time. So here's what I'm going to do. After we've agitated this bin around and aerated all the material, I'm not going to return that piece of paper or the plastic that was on here as coverings. The plastic will stay off because I want dryness to start happening here. I want this material to start shedding some of this moisture and start drying out. So hopefully this aeration will help that to a certain point, but by not having coverings on top, that's also going to help a great deal too. And then I'm also going to not return that piece of paper that we found on top that had that little party of mites on it. I don't want to reintroduce those mites into here if I don't have to. So I think that piece of paper that we took off the top, as well as these little bits that I collected along the way, I'm going to toss those into my outdoor compost bin. And out there, over time, all that stuff will break down nicely, I believe. I believe this is also a banana stem. Look how small it is. What I'll do is I'll just put a fresh piece of paper across the top to cover things up here. And that'll allow for a good amount of the moisture in here to just start evaporating out and allow the material in here to start drying off a little bit. And then once it gets dry enough that all the material in here is nice and flaky and can pass through a sifter, I believe that the next step when it comes to harvesting this is not going to be to try to migrate the worms out of it, but rather to simply harvest it by separating the worms from the castings using light, and then sifting the material that they've abandoned to separate any sort of large chunks that have not broken down, so that what's left is the really nice finished castings. So I think the lesson to be learned here is do not use treated paper in your bins, especially if it's been shredded into tiny bits, because it'll never go away. And just for the record, that paper was, it appeared to be just straight old brown paper bag material, but it was leaf bags. So in a way, I guess it sort of makes sense that, you know, if you're putting leaves into a bag, then you don't want that bag to deteriorate, maybe get wet because you've left it outside in the rain and start falling apart. So I believe that they probably treated those leaf bags with something to help prevent them from falling apart too quickly and making a big mess in everyone's yard with leaves falling all over the place. But because it's been treated, I believe that it's probably a good reason not to use it in composting scenarios. All right, I'm going to find myself a nice fresh piece of paper to cover up with, and then we'll be done here. Okay, and when I say fresh paper, by that I don't mean fresh as in new, because as you can see, this is a newspaper from almost 10 years ago. It's not even that thoroughly covering things, but that's going to be fine too. It's going to allow for a little bit of evaporation around the sides, and it'll also allow evaporation through the paper itself too. So I think this will actually do a really nice job allowing some of this moisture in this bin to get kicked off. But we will restore this piece of bamboo just to remind me that we're not feeding in here. I don't think I need the reminder, it's pretty clear. But I've got a little bit of cleaning up to do. You can see I've gotten a little bit of a head start here. Before I went to cut this piece of paper to size, I rinsed off a little bit. But besides putting things away and cleaning up, there's not much left to do here. But before I go, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate your time. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And hopefully we'll see you back here next time. If you haven't done so already, also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. Have a great day. Take care.